ago, we talked about God's judgment against the Amorites, the Edomites, and there were, before that, we talked about judgment against Damascus, and then the Heshbon people, people that were connected with Moab. Now, one might just ask the question, just to think about this whole thing for a while. Why all these judgments against these various nations? Why the judgment against the people of Noah's day? Why the judgment against Israel when they fell into corruption? Why all of this judgment? What lesson is there for us today in terms of the judgment of God, in this time world? What's the lesson? Kathy says that this is real, that evil is real, and there's judgment against evil, both in this world and the world to come. That is the judgment. Now, as we think about that, what right does God have to do this? God is the creator, Nikki says. God is sovereign. God is in charge. Now, Nikki says that that parents have the right to punish if need be. Does the social order have the right to punish? Does civil government have the right to punish? Nikki says there has to be consequences. Another way of saying that is that this demonstrates that man is accountable to God. People or nations are accountable to God. Individuals are accountable to God. So all of this should conjure up in our minds that we as individuals are accountable, and as Nikki said, there are consequences to our actions. Now, today we're going to look at the 28th chapter concerning, or 28th verse of the 49th chapter concerning Kedar. Now, this nation of Kedar, these people were descendants from the second son of Ishmael. Ishmael's second son was named Kedar, and this nation of Kedar was from that person. Isaiah and Ezekiel prophesy regarding Kedar. Now, nationally, or in terms of race, they were Arabs. They were nomadic. That is, they lived in tents. They moved from place to place. They lived kind of deep in the desert. Now, of course, it was Babylon's intent. It was Babylon's purpose. It was Babylon's proclivity to take over other nations. Nebuchadnezzar had that goal in mind of taking over other nations. Now, who would want, now think about this, what nation would want to go in deep into the desert to get a few camels and a few tents and a few utensils? What nation would want to, when there were other nations that had more and were easier to get to? Now, for an army to go deep into the desert would, there'd have to be some water supply. I mean, there'd have to be some provisions. But remembering that this was the judgment of God, that this would happen. Now, Kedar was a very let's say the people were very strong people. They'd have to be strong to have that kind of environment, to deal with that kind of environment. And concerning Kedar, the prophet says, and concerning the kingdoms of Hazar. So in the verse 28, he introduces Hazar, which Nebuchadnezzar, and here is specific, which Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, shall smite, and thus saith the Lord, arise ye and go up to Kedar, and spoil the men of the east. Now, I don't know how this communication got to Nebuchadnezzar. Probably he didn't. He was acting on his own volition and didn't need a message, directly from God. But God, through His providence, directed Nebuchadnezzar to deal with both Kedar and the other nation there, mentioned in the 28th verse, or in the next verse, the next couple verses there, including the next couple verses. Their tents now. Here's what Nebuchadnezzar was to do, to take of their spoil. Now, spoil, that's the what happens after battles, and the loser in a battle loses all of their stuff. And spoil the men of the east. Their tents and their flocks shall they take away. They shall take it to themselves. Their curtains, their vessels, whatever they had in terms of their subsistence, the things they needed for their subsistence, their camels, and they shall cry unto them. Fear is on every side. This would be a tremendous problem. This would be a tremendous, we would say a dramatic experience for these people. And he says there, and they shall cry unto them, fear is on every side. Now, Hazar is the next in line. And so the prophet says, flee, get ye far off, dwell deep, O ye inhabitants of Hazar, saith the Lord. For Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, hath taken counsel against you. What's that mean, taken counsel? When we talk about counsel, we think of legal lawyers and that sort of thing. Take counsel. Babylon hath taken counsel. That is, Babylon had devised a plan against them, and has conceived a purpose against you, or those two nations, and specifically here we're talking about Hazor. Verse 31, arise, get ye up into the wealthy nation. Now, that idea of the wealthy nation would indicate a strong nation, a robust nation, a nation that had some experience defending themselves, that dwelleth without care. Now, if you were deep in the desert, and you were a nomadic tribe, there's a certain security about being, deep in the desert, the way they were. And so they had the attitude, well, we're pretty safe because of our environment. Who would want to go into the desert after us? Kind of attitude. That dwelleth without care, saith the Lord, which hath neither gates nor bars, which dwell alone. Now think of the contrast between their means of protection and the means of protection that, say, Babylon had. And we'll talk about Babylon hopefully today as we go further in Jeremiah. Babylon was a huge, massive city with a huge, massive structure around it. But these people, what they had going for them was that they were in the desert area. And their camels shall be, in verse 32, and their camels shall be a booty, meaning that's going to be as part of the spoils of battle. And the multitude of their cattle, well, they must have had some livestock out there. There must have been some source of water in that particular area for those cattle to exist. And I will scatter into all winds them that are in the utmost corners. In other words, they're going to be scattered broadly, way, among the nations, those that would escape. And I will bring their calamity from all sides thereof, saith the Lord. Well, they're going to be surrounded in battle. In verse 33, and Hazor shall be a dwelling for dragons, and desolation forever. Now, that idea of being a dwelling for dragons, what's that imply? Well, it's just going to be out there, and there's going to be no human population. It's going to be for the animals that can subsist in that kind of environment. Dwelling for jackals or dragons, some sort of animals that can live in those kind of conditions. And a desolation forever. Well, looks like that place is going to be unpopulated. That particular real estate is going to be unpopulated for a season at least. Desolation forever. Therefore, or there shall be no man abide there, nor any son of man dwell in it. So that deals then. He's dealt there. The prophet now dealt with Hazor and Kedar. Now we go to the next one. The word of the Lord that came to Jeremiah, the prophet, against Elam in the beginning of the reign of Zedekiah. Now, here we have it dated. In the beginning of the reign of Zedekiah. You'll recall that Zedekiah was the last king of Judah. He was a kind of a puppet king appointed by Nebuchadnezzar. He eventually, near the end of his 11-year reign, rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, and was he was blinded by Nebuchadnezzar. His sons were killed before he was blinded, and he was carried off into Babylonian captivity. But it was during that period of time when the armies of Babylon were active in that area of Jerusalem. So, Elam. Now, who's Elam? Well, the Elamites were a strong people. Verse 36. Well, in verse 35, thus saith the Lord of hosts, behold, I will break the bow of Elam, the chief of their might. Now, I'll break the bow. These people were, according to history, were skilled archers. That's how they fought. The bow and arrow sort of thing, the archers. So God says, I'm going to break your bow. What's that mean? I'm going to destroy your defense. I will bring the four winds from the four quarters of heaven. Now, when in that language, that metaphor, I will bring the four winds from the four quarters of heaven. What's that mean? This assault is going to be from. We talk about, the Bible talks about the four corners of the earth, meaning, all the throughout, at least throughout the region. There's going to be massive assaults on every side, and I will scatter them toward all those winds. All the areas from which these assaults are coming. I suppose they took captives. And some of them escaped. If you had any sense in that era, and you really heard and believed that there was going to be destruction, you'd probably want to hightail it out of Dodge. Well, but the idea here was that these people would be they would be outcast. That is, they would be scattered. At least some of them. Now we know that some of them survived. Some of the Edomites survived, and we'll talk about that later. But generally speaking, there would be some major destruction. And people would be scattered. I will cause Elam to be dismayed, that is, frightened, before their enemies, before them that seek their life. They had defenses. They had their archery, their skilled archers and that sort of thing. But they're going to be, when they see the battle axes of the Babylonians, they're going to be frightened. And before them that seek their life, I will bring evil upon them, even my fierce anger. Now, God's fierce anger had to do with their evil nature, had to do with their worshiping idols. He's going to bring his fierce anger is going to bring destruction. And I will send the sword after them till I have consumed them. And I will set my throne in Elam. Now, what's that mean? I'll set my throne in Elam. What's he saying there? He's saying, God is saying, I'm going to be in charge of this. My throne would indicate the presence of God. And God would be there to see that they were destroyed. I will set my throne in Elam, and will destroy them. Thence the king and the princes, saith the Lord. Everybody, princes, kings, people at all parts of the continuum, for just everybody, high and low in that kingdom. But, verse 39, it shall come to pass in the latter days. It shall come to pass in the latter days. Now, the latter days often refers to another period of time, right? It often refers to the next period of time. Usually it refers to the New Testament period of time when we talk about the latter days. It shall come to pass in the latter days that I will bring again the captivity of Elam, saith the Lord. Let's go over to and we've done this before, but just as a reminder, let's just go over to the second chapter of Acts and look at the array of people that were assembled on the day of Pentecost and heard Peter herald in the kingdom of God on earth, herald in the church. we've looked at this a couple of times, but let's just remind ourselves. In verse 8 of the second chapter, as these things were transpiring on the day of Pentecost, and there in verse 7, let's begin, and they were all amazed. Well, now let's go back to verse 6 and get the whole picture. Now when this was noised abroad, that is, what was being said, now when this was noised abroad, the multitude came together and were confounded, because every man heard them speak in his own language. And they were all amazed and marveled, saying one to another, Behold, are not these which speak Galileans? And how hear we every man in our own language wherein we were born? Now, he starts to list then. He lists all of these various cultures and races and nationalities. Now, I don't imagine that he listed all of them. I think this was probably just a sample of a sample of the list. How hear we every man in our own language wherein we were born? Parthians and Medes and Elamites. You see the connection there? Going to be some return. Elam isn't going to be completely eliminated. The Elamites aren't going to be completely eliminated. And the dwellers in Mesopotamia and in Judea and Cappadocia, in Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia and Egypt, and the parts of Libya about Cyrene, and strangers of Rome, Jews and proselytes, Cretes and Arabians. Now we talked about some people that were assimilated into the Arabian culture, and they were, there was an indication that they were going to be preserved, at least a remnant of them. Cretes and Arabians, do we hear them speak in our own tongues the wonderful works of God? And they were all amazed and were in doubt. Now, what did they hear? The wonderful works of God. And they didn't quite immediately understand what the implications, what the consequences, what the end result would be of them hearing the wonderful works of God. So here we have the connection between the prophecy of Jeremiah and the New Testament era, when some of these descendants of the Elamites were present on the day of Pentecost. Now then, God used Babylon to destroy a lot of these nations, races, and peoples. And now it's going to be Babylon's turn in the barrel, so to speak. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of that term, their turn in the barrel. But it has to do, it's their turn to get destruction. Now, we're in chapter 50 then, the word that the Lord spake against Babylon. Now, Babylon was the main center. That was the city. That was the designated city. And against the land of the Chaldeans. They were generally called the Chaldeans by Jeremiah the prophet. Now, this nation of Babylon, or this Babylon, obviously came against Judah and these nations around. Babylon was now subject to this judgment. Now, the city of Babylon was probably thought to be impermeable. Who could overthrow Babylon? The city of Babylon straddled the Euphrates River. Historians indicate, and there's different judgments about how big some of these things were, but it is said that in Babylon, in ancient Babylon, they had 60 miles of walls. Now, think about it in this way. The Interstate 270 is 50 miles around. Think about what territory that includes. But this city was then a massive city. Some historians and scholars believe that they had enough provisions to subsist for 20 years. You know, they were preppers. They had provisions to exist. These walls is believed that were some 300 feet high. Now think of that. Think of a wall 300 feet wide around 270. That the walls were in the range of 90 feet wide, or 90 feet thick. Now, what power could penetrate that city? They could cut off maybe commerce going in and out, but those people had provisions for a couple of decades available to them. Well, God is in charge of this scenario, and so what happens here to what's going to happen to Babylon? The word that the Lord made against Babylon and against the land of the Chaldeans by Jeremiah the prophet. Declare ye among the nations, and publish, and set up standard. Publish, and conceal not. Say Babylon is taken. Now, generally speaking, do countries know what's happening in other countries? Hasn't there always been, let's say, spies, people that carried information from one nation to another? The scenes in our nation this past week weren't lost on the world. Some people in other countries know more about what happened in the United States than the average person in the United States. I mean, this is going to be what's happened. Of course, what's going to happen to Babylon is going to be a matter of common knowledge throughout the known world. Babylon is taken. Bel is confounded. Now, who's Bel? Bel was their chief god. And Merodach, another, derivation of Bel, their chief god, is broken in pieces. Her idols are confounded. Her images are broken in pieces. There is evidence, and scholars have indicated that there were, within Babylon, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of chapels, temples, places of worship for all these various idols that the Babylonians worshipped. This is they were steeped in idolatry of various stripes and measures. They were really into idolatry. Her images are broken. Now, God's going to destroy the idols. And when God is pronouncing judgment against nations in the various prophecies, he mentions the idols, the idolatry. And of course that idolatry was mixed with debased human behavior. Molech was based on it controlled human behavior to the extent that some people offered their babies, burnt them in the fires. There's all kinds of debauchery connected with idolatry in the Old Testament era. So idolatry and human evils go hand in hand, you see. And I guess one supports the other. There's a synergy there between this idolatry and debauchery, ill behavior on the part of human beings. So in verse 3, for out of the north there cometh a nation against her. Well, that would be Babylon. That would be the Chaldeans, which shall make her land desolate, and none shall dwell therein. They shall remove, they shall depart, both man and beast. The nation is going to be desolate. Now those who Google ancient Babylon, or whatever, however you get your information, 40 to 50 miles away from Baghdad, right? And you can see pictures of ancient Babylon. The only thing you can see that looks like it's a structure is the big palace that Saddam Hussein put on a mound among the rubble of Babylon. Hussein kind of thought he was the next generation Nebuchadnezzar. He had a big palace. He put a big palace there among that rubble. But what do you see when you see ancient Babylon today? Look it up. Rubble, stone. Just a good tomcat wouldn't live there. It's just a barren. Now that didn't happen immediately, but over time that happened. That is the destruction. The desolation of Babylon. Verse 4, in those days and in that time, saith the Lord, the children of Israel shall come, and they and the children of Judah together going and weeping. They shall go and seek the Lord their God, and they shall ask the way to Zion, with their faces thitherward, saying, come and let us join ourselves to the Lord in a perpetual covenant that may not be forgotten. And so now, if we went over to the book of Daniel and we looked at Daniel's record of what happened at the end of the Babylonian era, you recall that it was probably the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. They were having a big bash among the nobles, and you remember what happened? They hauled out the temple vessels, and were drinking booze out of the temple vessels. And there was a hand appeared, writing on the wall. What did that say? Essentially, it says, your time is up. Babylon is gone. And so this city of Babylon that couldn't be penetrated in terms of the walls fell to the Medo-Persian Empire, as recorded in the book of Daniel, and of course we know that, history just bears out that the Medo-Persians came in and destroyed the Babylonians, but then there's a ray of hope here for the people of Judah and other Jews of the other tribes of Israel. They're going to come back. The remnant, some of them, are going to come back to Jerusalem. And we know Jerusalem was rebuilt. Now, he goes in verse 6, he kind of goes back in history and describes how Judah and Israel got into captivity, but a remnant of them came back. My people, he's saying, my people have been lost sheep. Their shepherds have caused them to go astray. Now, think about that for a moment. The leadership of the northern tribes of Israel caused the people to worship an idol at Dan and Bethel, right? They worshipped, at times they worshipped Baal. And who is responsible for that? Who set the pace? It was the king. There wasn't a good king of northern Israel. They were all debased. And then in Judah, the kings, when we talk about the kings, we're talking about the leadership. We're talking about the kings and the people that surround the king. The people that are, kind of in charge of the social order. People that are in charge of the religious order. What happened to the priests? What happened to the religious people in Judah? Things got so bad in Judah that they were worshiping idols in the temple of God. See, the leadership was, there was a leadership void, but not only a void, but it was that the leaders led them astray. It says here they caused them. The shepherds caused the sheep. They led the sheep into a den of wolves. Turned them away on the mountains. They turned them away on the mountains. Where were these shrines? Where were these shrines, these chapels, these places of worship? These idolatrous places of worship. They're in the mountains. Where were they supposed to be worshiping? The temple, Jerusalem. They've gone from mountain to hill, and they've forgotten their resting place. And of course, their refuge, their resting place was God. In verse 7. And that found them have devoured them. Now those that they were led astray, you see the symbolism here? They were led astray, and then what happened then was that they were scattered, metaphorically scattered. At least they were away from God. And so the enemy then devoured them. And their adversary said, now look at the attitude of Babylon. The enemies of the Jews. We offend not. They're saying, we didn't do anything wrong by destroying Jerusalem, because they have sinned against the Lord. Now, do you suppose Nebuchadnezzar, he was thinking, well, I'm going to do God's will here, that Jehovah God, I'm going to do his will and I'm going to destroy his people? Probably not. He was destroying nations around about that weren't of Jewish origin. So the idea here is that this was just this is just kind of a ploy. This was just a justification for what they did, a self-justification for what they did to the Jews. Then they found him, devoured them, and their adversaries said, we offend not, because they have sinned against the Lord, the habitation of justice, even the Lord, the hope of their fathers. Remove out, in verse 8, remove out of the midst of Babylon, and go forth out of the land of the Chaldeans, and be as he-goats before the flocks. Now, what's a he-goat? I guess it would be a ram, thinking in terms of sheep, a ram that would lead sheep. He's talking about here leaders, and be as the leaders before the flock. That's an admonition to the Jews as they went back to Jerusalem. Verse 9, for lo, I will raise and cause to come up against Babylon an assembly of great nations from the north country. Not only Babylon, but Nebuchadnezzar would get other nations. He would, I suppose, threaten other nations. You be with us, or we're going to turn on you. And so there are various nations, and some of them of their own, other nations of their own volition, would come against Babylon. An assembly of nations from the north country. And they shall set themselves in array against her, for thence she shall be taken. Their arrows shall be as a mighty expert man. None shall return in vain. And Chaldea shall be a spoil. That is, they're going to there's going to be a lot of loot for the opposing armies to aggregate. And that spoil her shall be satisfied, saith the Lord. Because ye were glad, because ye rejoiced, O ye destroyers of mine heritage. Now, God commissioned Babylon to destroy Jerusalem, but it says here, but these people, he says, O ye destroyers of my heritage, because ye are grown fat as the heifer at grass, and because and bellow as a bull. Arrogance here. You see, this had to do with arrogance. Okay, well, we'll start there next week at the 12th verse of Jeremiah 50.